The morning sun blazed mercilessly over Birmingham, Alabama, on May 15, 1963, casting long shadows across the red brick buildings that lined the segregated downtown streets. 7-year-old Marcus Washington adjusted his best Sunday shirt, the crisp white one his mother had ironed with such care the night before, and gripped his father's strong, calloused hand as they approached Kelly Ingram Park. The air hummed with an electric energy that made the fine hairs on the back of his neck stand up, though he couldn't yet understand why. Around them, hundreds of children gathered like a river of determination flowing through the streets. Some were barely old enough for kindergarten, others on the cusp of high school graduation. They came from every corner of Birmingham's black community, from the shotgun houses of Smithfield to the modest brick homes near Miles College. Marcus marveled at the sea of young faces, all united by a dream his father had explained to him in simple terms. We want to be treated like people. Son, nothing more, nothing less. Reverend James Washington, a towering figure with gentle eyes and a voice that could shake the rafters of Mount Olive Baptist Church, knelt beside his son. His large hands, scarred from years of manual labor before his calling to ministry, cupped Marcus's small face. Remember what we talked about, little Nan? We walk with love in our hearts, even when others show us hate. Can you do that for Daddy? Marcus nodded solemnly, though his stomach churned with nervous excitement. He'd heard the adults whispering about Bull Connor and police dogs in hushed tones that made him feel scared without understanding why. But his father's presence made him feel brave, invincible even. If Daddy said they were doing the right thing, then nothing bad could happen. The children began their march at 1 p.m. sharp, their voices rising in harmony as they sang, "We shall overcome." Marcus walked between his father and his 15-year-old sister Carmen, whose yellow sundress brightened the gray concrete like a sunflower in a storm. She wore her hair in 2 neat braids, tied with matching yellow ribbons, and she sang with the passion of someone who truly believed change was coming. Marcus tried to match her enthusiasm, his small voice joining the chorus that echoed off the surrounding buildings. As they approached the park, Marcus noticed the wall of blue uniforms blocking their path. Police officers stood in rigid formation, their faces hidden behind reflective sunglasses that made them look like robots rather than men. Behind them, fire trucks waited ominously, their hoses coiled like sleeping serpents. But it was what Marcus saw next that made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. The dogs. German shepherds strained against thick leather leashes, their powerful muscles rippling beneath black and tan coats. They panted heavily in the Alabama heat, pink tongues lolling from mouths filled with gleaming white teeth. Marcus had seen dogs before, friendly ones that wagged their tails and licked children's faces. These were different. These animals looked hungry, predatory, as if they were waiting for permission to hunt. One dog in particular caught Marcus's attention. Larger than the others, with distinctive white patches on its chest and front paws, it seemed to stare directly at him. Its ears stood erect, alert to every sound, every movement. A jagged scar ran across its muzzle, giving it a permanent snarl that made Marcus's stomach clench with fear. The dog's handler, a thick-set officer with a red face and cold blue eyes, seemed to be struggling to control the beast. "Keep walking, children," Reverend Washington called out, his voice steady despite the obvious danger ahead. "Remember, we are warriors of peace." But peace was about to shatter like glass against concrete. Commissioner Bull Connor's voice crackled over a police radio. "Let him have it." The words carried across the park like a death sentence. Marcus watched in slow-motion horror as the officers released their grip on the leashes. 6 German shepherds bounded forward like missiles launched from hell itself. A scarred dog, the one that had been watching Marcus, moved with terrifying speed and purpose. It bypassed the smaller children and targeted the teenagers at the front of the march. Carmen screamed as the animal launched itself at her, its massive paws striking her shoulders and sending her sprawling onto the hot pavement. The yellow dress that had looked so beautiful moments before now bore dirty tears where claws had raked across fabric. "Carmen!" Marcus shrieked, breaking free from his father's grasp and running toward his sister. But strong arms swept him up before he could reach her. Reverend Washington held his son tight against his chest, shielding the boy's eyes from the chaos erupting around them. But Marcus had already seen too much. The scarred dog stood over Carmen, not biting, but intimidating. Its massive head lowered as saliva dripped from its open mouth onto her torn dress. The animal's eyes cold, calculating, almost intelligent in their cruelty, seemed to memorize every detail of the terrified girl beneath it. Other children scattered like leaves in a hurricane, their songs of freedom replaced by screams of terror. Fire hoses joined the assault, sending streams of water powerful enough to strip bark from trees into the crowd of young protesters. Marcus watched his friends and neighbors tumble across the pavement like rag dolls, their Sunday clothes soaked and ruined. The combination of dogs and water created absolute pandemonium, transforming a peaceful demonstration into a war zone. Through it all, the scarred dog remained fixed in Marcus's memory. Even as his father carried him to safety, even as they fled the park with Carmen limping between them, the boy couldn't stop seeing those predatory eyes. They seemed to follow him, to promise that this wasn't over, that they would meet again. That night, as his mother tended to Carmen's scratches and his father met with other ministers to plan their next move, Marcus lay awake in his small bed. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the dog. Every creak of the house made him think. It was coming for him. He'd learned that day that the world contained a type of evil he'd never imagined. Not just mean people, but mean people with weapons designed to hurt children. The scarred dog had shown him that some monsters were real, and they wore badges. Little did Marcus know that in just 3 weeks he would face that monster again, this time in a courtroom, where his 2 simple words would help change the course of history forever. The red and blue lights of police cruisers painted the Washington family's modest shotgun house in ominous colors as dawn broke over Birmingham 3 days after the attack. Marcus pressed his face against the cool window glass of his bedroom, watching officers surround their home like wolves circling prey. His breath fogged the window as his heart hammered against his small ribcage. Something terrible was about to happen. He could feel it in the oppressive silence that had settled over their usually bustling neighborhood. "James Washington." The voice boomed through a megaphone, shattering the morning stillness. "Come out with your hands visible." In the kitchen, Sarah Washington's coffee cup slipped from her trembling fingers, crashing against the linoleum floor in a symphony of breaking ceramic. The bitter liquid spread like a dark stain across the worn pattern, mirroring the fear that spread through her chest. She'd known this moment would come, had dreaded it since the march, but knowing didn't make it any easier to bear. Reverend Washington emerged from the back bedroom, his face calm, but his eyes betraying the storm within. He'd spent the night in prayer, preparing himself for what seemed inevitable. A man who could command a congregation of 500 with. His powerful voice now spoke in gentle whispers to avoid frightening his children further. "Sarah, take the children to Mama Ruby's house through the back door," he instructed, kissing his wife's forehead with infinite tenderness. "Don't let them see this." But Marcus had already seen everything. From his window perch, he watched his father step onto their small front porch, hands raised high in surrender. The boy didn't understand why his hero, the man who could make angels weep with his sermons, was giving up without a fight. "Daddy's not a bad man," Marcus whispered to himself, his breath creating new fog circles on the glass. "Daddy helps people." The lead officer, Detective Ray Morrison approached with handcuffs gleaming in the morning light. Morrison had a reputation in the community, not as a brutal racist like some others, but as a man who followed orders without question, regardless of their moral implications. His weathered face showed no emotion as he read the charges that would change the Washington family forever. James Washington, you're under arrest for disturbing the peace, inciting a riot, and endangering the welfare of minors. I led a peaceful prayer march, Reverend Washington replied with dignity intact, even as cold metal cuffs clicked around his wrists. The only danger to those children came from your dogs. Morrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He knew the charges were fabricated, designed to break the spirit of the civil rights movement one leader at a time. But orders were orders, and Morrison had learned long ago not to question the system that fed his family. As they led Reverend Washington toward the patrol car, Marcus broke free from his mother's protective grasp and bolted outside. His bare feet slapped against the cold concrete as he ran to his father, tears streaming down his cheeks like summer. "Rain, Daddy, don't go," he cried, wrapping his small arms around his father's legs. "You didn't do anything wrong." The officers paused, perhaps momentarily touched by the child's innocent anguish. Reverend Washington looked down at his son, with eyes full of love and sorrow. Despite the handcuffs, he managed to place a gentle hand on Marcus's head. "Listen to me, son," he said, his voice carrying the same power that filled churches every Sunday. "Sometimes good people have to suffer for doing what's right. But that doesn't make it wrong. Promise me you'll remember that." Marcus nodded through his tears, not fully understanding, but sensing the weight of his father's words. Two officers gently but firmly separated the boy from his father, their faces showing the first signs of discomfort with their assignment. The patrol car's engine rumbled to life like a growling beast. Marcus watched helplessly as his father disappeared behind tinted windows, the vehicle carrying away the most important person in his 7-year-old world. Neighbors emerged from their homes, some crying openly, others standing in respectful silence as the procession of police cars vanished around the corner. Inside the cramped jail cell downtown, Reverend Washington sat on a thin mattress that smelled of disinfectant and despair. Through the barred window, he could see the spire of his own church in the distance, so close yet unreachable. He thought about Marcus's tear-stained face and wondered if involving children in the movement had been a mistake. But then he remembered the alternative, allowing another generation to grow up accepting injustice as normal. Meanwhile, at Ruby Washington's house across town, Marcus refused to eat, refused to play, refused to do anything but stare out the window toward downtown where his father was locked away. His grandmother, a woman who'd survived the Depression and raised 8 children during the worst of Jim Crow, tried every trick she knew to coax a smile from the boy. "Your daddy's gonna be just fine, baby," she assured him, though her own voice wavered with uncertainty. "He's strong like his daddy before him, and his daddy before that." But Marcus wasn't comforted. In his young mind, a terrible injustice had occurred. His father, who spent his life helping others, who fed hungry families and visited sick neighbors, who preached love even toward enemies, now sat in a cage like a criminal. The same police who were supposed to protect people had become the monsters in his story. As night fell over Birmingham, news of Reverend Washington's arrest spread through the civil rights network like wildfire. Phone calls buzzed between churches, community centers, and the offices of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. A young attorney named David Thornton, working late in his Atlanta office, received one such call that would change everything. "They've arrested James Washington," the voice reported. "And David, there's something else. His little boy witnessed the whole dog attack. The child might be our key to exposing what really happened out there." Thornton set down his coffee. his legal mind already calculating possibilities. Children made powerful witnesses. Their honesty was unquestionable, their trauma undeniable. But putting a 7-year-old through a trial would be its own form of cruelty. Back in his jail cell, Reverend Washington knelt on the cold concrete floor and prayed for his family, his community, and even for the officers who'd arrested him. He had no way of knowing that his son's witness to that terrifying day would soon become the weapon that would help strike a blow against the very system that had caged him. The wheels of justice, slow and often broken in the segregated South, were about to be set in motion by the courage of a child who'd seen too much, but would find the strength to speak truth to power. The sleek, black Cadillac rolled through Birmingham's segregated streets like a ship cutting through hostile waters, its chrome bumpers reflecting the suspicious stares of white pedestrians who recognized it didn't belong in their carefully maintained world of separation. Behind the wheel sat David Thornton, his dark hands gripping the leather steering wheel with the same determination that had carried him through Harvard Law School, despite being one of only 3 black students in his class. At 28, Thornton had already earned a reputation as the South's most formidable civil rights attorney. His 3-piece suits were always immaculate, his arguments surgical in their precision, and his courtroom presence so commanding that even racist judges found themselves listening despite their prejudices. But success had come at a cost. Death threats arrived in his mail weekly, and he had learned to check under his car for bombs before every trip. The Washington House sat in the heart of Birmingham's Collegeville neighborhood, a modest structure that somehow radiated warmth despite the circumstances. As Thornton parked, he noticed the subtle signs of a community under siege. Curtains that twitched as neighbors watched for threats, children who played closer to their front porches than usual, and the conspicuous absence of the usual street activity that made black neighborhoods vibrant. Sarah Washington answered the door before he could knock, her intuition sharpened by days of anxiety. She was a small woman with intelligent eyes that had seen too much sorrow for someone barely 30 years old. Her floral dress, carefully mended in places, spoke of pride maintained despite economic hardship. "Mr. Thornton," she said, relief flooding her voice. "Thank God you came." He followed her into a living room that told the story of a family's values in its every detail. Hand-sewn quilts draped over second-hand furniture, family photographs arranged with loving care on a mantelpiece, books everywhere, theology, literature, children's stories, evidence of a household that valued education and enlightenment, even when the world outside tried to deny them both. Marcus sat curled in the corner of an old sofa, his small frame dwarfed by pillows that had been plumped with desperate hope that comfort could somehow heal trauma. The boy who'd run fearlessly to his father's side during the arrest now flinched at every car that passed outside. His once bright eyes had dimmed to the color of storm clouds, and he hadn't spoken more than single-word answers since watching his father disappear into that police car. "He's been like this for 3 days, Sarah explained, her voice breaking slightly. "Won't eat properly, won't play with his toys. He just sits there, staring at nothing." Thornton had seen this before. Children whose spirits had been fractured by witnessing violence. They were too young to understand, but there was something different about Marcus, something in the way his eyes tracked movement, as if he was memorizing details for some future purpose. Carmen emerged from the kitchen, carrying a tray of sweet tea, her yellow dress replaced by a simple blue one that couldn't quite hide the bandages on her arms, where the dog's claws had found their mark. At 15, she was trying to be the adult her family needed, but Thornton could see the fear she was working so hard to conceal. "Tell me exactly what happened," Thornton said gently, settling into a chair across from the family. "Everything you remember, no matter how small it seems." For the next hour, Sarah and Carmen recounted the events in heartbreaking detail, the peaceful nature of the march, the sudden release of the dogs, the specific targeting of teenage girls by the animals. But it was Marcus who provided the detail that made Thornton's pulse quicken. The big dog, Marcus suddenly spoke, his first complete sentence in days. He had white paws and a scar on his face. He looked mean on purpose. Thornton leaned forward, his legal instincts firing. "Marcus, do you think you'd recognize that dog if you saw him again?" The boy nodded without hesitation, a flicker of his old fire returning to his eyes. "I remember everything about him. Everything." This was the breakthrough Thornton had hoped for, but hadn't dared expect. Eyewitness testimony from a child carried unique power chords, might question adult motivations, but few could doubt a 7-year-old's honest observations. However, the thought of putting Marcus through a trial made his stomach clench with moral uncertainty. "Sarah," he said carefully, "I need to ask you something difficult. Marcus might be the key to winning your husband's case and exposing what really happened that day. But testifying would mean reliving the trauma, facing hostile questioning, being in the same room as those officers again." Sarah's hand moved protectively to Marcus's shoulder. "What kind of mother would I be if I let them hurt my baby again?" "The kind who understands that sometimes children have to be brave, so other children won't have to be," Thornton replied gently. "But the choice is yours. I won't pressure you." That evening, Thornton sat in his hotel room at the black-owned Gaston Motel, reviewing police reports and witness statements by lamplight. The more he studied the case, the more convinced he became that the dog attacks weren't random acts of crowd control. They were calculated intimidation tactics designed to terrorize children into abandoning the movement. His phone rang at midnight. Sarah's voice was steady but tired. "Mr. Thornton, I talked to James through the jail chaplain. He said if Marcus is strong enough and willing, we should let him tell his truth. That little boy has been carrying this burden for days. Maybe it's time to let him put it down by speaking it out loud." Thornton smiled in the darkness of his hotel room. He'd seen this before: families who discovered that their deepest trauma could become their greatest weapon against injustice. But this case felt different. This time, the witness was a child whose innocence could cut through decades of legal precedent and social conditioning. "I'll need to prepare him carefully," Thornton warned. "The prosecution will try to confuse him, intimidate him. Are you sure he's ready for that?" "My son saw evil that day, Mr. Thornton. Real evil with teeth and claws and a badge giving it permission. If speaking truth about that evil can help his daddy and other children, then yes, he's ready." As Thornton hung up the phone, he felt the familiar mixture of excitement and dread that came with taking on a case that could change everything. Tomorrow, he would begin preparing a 7-year-old boy to face down a system designed to silence him. But Marcus Washington was about to prove that sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest power. Jefferson County Courthouse loomed over downtown Birmingham like a monument to white supremacy, its imposing limestone columns casting long shadows across the segregated streets below. Built in 1929 during the height of Jim Crow, every inch of the building had been designed to intimidate those who dared challenge the established order. As David Thornton climbed its marble steps for the first time, briefcase in hand and determination in his heart, he felt the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders. Inside, the courthouse buzzed with an energy that crackled like electricity before a storm. Reporters from major newspapers had descended on Birmingham like vultures sensing a feast. Walter Cronkite's CBS crew had set up equipment in the hallway, their cameras trained on anyone who might provide a quote about the upcoming trial. The New York Times had sent their best correspondent, while local papers prepared to document what many sensed could become a watershed moment in the civil rights struggle. Judge Harold Whitmore's chambers occupied the courthouse's most prestigious corner, its windows offering a commanding view of the city he'd helped keep segregated for over 2 decades. At 63, Whitmore had never lost a case involving civil rights protesters, a record he wore like a badge of honor. His law books, bound in rich leather, contained margin notes that revealed his philosophy: order above justice, tradition above progress, white authority above all else. This Washington trial, he told his clerk that morning while adjusting his black robes, needs to be handled with particular care. Too many outside agitators are watching. 3 blocks away, in a cramped office above Johnson's barbershop, Thornton worked 18-hour days preparing his defense. Legal documents covered every surface like snow, and empty coffee cups created rings on tables that hadn't seen proper meals in weeks. His assistant, a brilliant young woman named Dorothy Hayes, who'd graduated summa cum laude from Howard Law, but couldn't find work at white firms, helped him construct their strategy piece by piece. The prosecution's case is built on lies, Dorothy observed, spreading police reports across the makeshift conference table. Look at these incident reports. They claim the marchers were violent, but every photograph shows children running away from dogs, not toward officers. Thornton studied the documents with the intensity of a surgeon examining X-rays. They're counting on Judge Whitmore to accept their version without scrutiny. Our job is to make the truth so undeniable that even he can't ignore it. The most delicate part of their preparation involved Marcus himself. Dr. Patricia Coleman, one of the few black psychologists practicing in Alabama, had been working with the boy for 2 weeks. Her office, located in the basement of 16th Street Baptist Church, had become a sanctuary where Marcus could process his trauma without judgment. He's making progress, Dr. Coleman reported during one of their evening meetings. The nightmares are less frequent, and he's starting to talk about the attack without shutting down completely. But David, you need to understand putting him on that witness stand could undo everything we've accomplished. Thornton wrestled with the moral implications daily. His legal mind knew that Marcus's testimony could be devastating to the prosecution's case. The boy's innocent honesty, his detailed memories, his ability to identify the specific dog that had terrorized him all of it could expose the systematic brutality that officials were trying to cover up. But his heart ached at the thought of subjecting a traumatized child to the hostile environment of Whitmore's courtroom. We practice every day, he explained to Dr. Coleman. Not the testimony itself. I won't coach him on what to say. But we practice being brave, practice speaking clearly, practice not being afraid of men in uniforms. The preparation sessions took place in Thornton's temporary office, with Marcus sitting in a child-sized chair that Dorothy had borrowed from a local school. The boy's transformation over those 2 weeks was remarkable. A frightened, withdrawn child gradually gave way to someone stronger, someone who seemed to understand that his voice might matter in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. Tell me about the dog again, Thornton would say gently, never pushing too hard. He was big and mean, Marcus would respond, his voice growing steadier each time. He had white on his feet and a cut on his face that made him look angry all the time. His eyes were scary, like he wanted to hurt people. Meanwhile, the prosecution was conducting its own preparations. District Attorney Robert Henley, a career politician who'd built his reputation on maintaining Birmingham's segregated status quo, met regularly with police officials to coordinate their strategy. They knew the case was being watched nationally, which meant they couldn't afford their usual heavy-handed tactics. The key is to discredit the father without making him a martyr, Henley instructed his team. Portray him as a reckless agitator who endangered children for his own political gain. Officer Frank Sullivan, handler of the scarred German shepherd named Rex, attended several of these strategy sessions. Sullivan was a 15-year veteran of the force who trained Rex specifically for crowd control during civil rights demonstrations. What the prosecution didn't know what Sullivan himself barely acknowledged was that he deliberately encouraged Rex's aggressive behavior, viewing the dog as a weapon to terrorize protesters into submission. That dog is perfectly trained, Sullivan assured the district attorney. He only attacks when commanded and only uses necessary force. It was a lie, and Sullivan knew it. Rex had developed a taste for the hunt, an eagerness for violence that made him particularly effective at breaking up peaceful demonstrations. But admitting that would mean acknowledging that they'd turned a police dog into something closer to a weapon of war. As the trial date approached, Birmingham held its breath. Churches organized prayer vigils for the Washington family. Civil rights organizations sent observers from across the country. The FBI opened a file on the proceedings, though their interest lay more in monitoring activists than ensuring justice. In his jail cell, Reverend Washington spent his days in prayer and preparation, knowing that his fate, and perhaps the fate of the broader movement, might soon rest in the small hands of his 7-year-old son. He'd taught Marcus to speak truth and stand for what's right, never imagining how literally those lessons would be tested. The stage was set for a confrontation that would pit a child's innocence against a system built on lies. A battle where 2 simple words would prove more powerful than decades of legal precedent. The gavel's sharp crack echoed through the packed courtroom like a gunshot, officially opening the trial that would captivate a nation. Judge Harold Whitmore's steely gaze swept across the segregated gallery, whites on one side, blacks on the other, with a literal wooden barrier maintaining Birmingham's rigid social order, even within the halls of justice. The morning light streaming through tall windows illuminated the tense faces of spectators, who sensed they were witnessing history in the making. District Attorney Robert Henley rose from his table with the practiced confidence of a man who'd never lost a case involving civil rights protesters. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his navy suit pressed to perfection, and his smile carried the cold calculation of a predator preparing to strike. At 55, Henley had built his political career on maintaining the status quo, and he wasn't about to let a black preacher and his supporters upset the delicate balance of power that kept Birmingham firmly under white control. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Henley began, his voice carrying the honeyed drawl that had charmed voters for decades. "This case is not about civil rights or social justice. This is about a reckless man who willfully endangered the lives of innocent children for his own political agenda." The jury, 12 white men selected from Birmingham's most conservative neighborhoods, nodded along as Henley painted Reverend Washington as a dangerous radical who'd manipulated children into participating in illegal demonstrations. The prosecutor's words dripped with false concern for the very children his side had attacked with dogs and fire hoses. James Washington knew that bringing children to an illegal assembly would provoke a response from law enforcement. Henley continued, his finger pointing accusingly at the defendant's table. He calculated that images of children in distress would generate sympathy for his cause. In short, he used those babies as human shields. David Thornton's jaw clenched as he listened to the character assassination of a man whose only crime was demanding basic human dignity. Beside him, an empty chair waited for Reverend Washington, who remained in custody despite Thornton's attempts to secure bail. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Justice itself seemed absent from these proceedings. The prosecution's first witness was Police Chief Arthur Hanson, a mountain of a man whose presence commanded respect and fear in equal measure. His uniform bore more decorations than a war hero's, each medal representing another victory in his personal campaign to maintain Birmingham's segregated society. The defendants organized an illegal assembly without proper permits, Hanson testified, his voice booming across the courtroom. When they refused to disperse, we had no choice but to use appropriate force to protect public safety. Hansen's testimony painted a picture of reasonable law enforcement responding to dangerous agitators. He described the marchers as aggressive and threatening, claiming they'd thrown rocks and bottles at officers. Each lie rolled off his tongue with practiced ease, supported by carefully edited police reports that omitted crucial details about the violence inflicted on children. But it was Officer Frank Sullivan's testimony that truly sickened Thornton. Sullivan took the stand with Rex lying calmly beside him, the scarred German Shepherd's presence serving as both evidence and intimidation. The dog's distinctive white markings were clearly visible to everyone in the courtroom, though Sullivan seemed oblivious to the psychological impact his animal was having on the Washington family. Rex is a highly trained police dog, Sullivan testified, his thick Alabama accent making each word sound like a verdict. He responds only to specific commands and uses minimal force necessary to subdue suspects. These animals are tools of law enforcement, not weapons of aggression. As Sullivan spoke, Marcus sat in the gallery clutching his grandmother Ruby's hand so tightly her fingers turned white. The boy's eyes never left Rex, studying the animal that had haunted his nightmares. Ruby felt the child's body trembling and whispered prayers for strength, both for Marcus and for the justice system that seemed determined to protect the very officers who terrorized her great-grandson. Thornton's cross-examination began like a scalpel cutting through lies. Officer Sullivan, how many times has Rex been deployed against civil rights demonstrators in the past year? I don't keep specific records. 47 times, Thornton interrupted, consulting his notes. 47 separate incidents involving peaceful protesters. Would you say that's excessive for a dog trained to use minimal force? Sullivan's confidence began to crack like ice under pressure. Rex follows orders. If there were problems, they were caused by the protesters' behavior. Really? Thornton pulled out a thick folder of photographs. I have documentation of Rex attacking elderly women, pregnant mothers, and children as young as 6 years old. Would you characterize a 6-year-old as threatening to a trained officer? The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Thornton displayed photo after photo of Rex's victims. Each image told a story of systematic brutality disguised as law enforcement. Sullivan's face reddened as his carefully constructed narrative crumbled under the weight of evidence. Objection! Henley shouted, recognizing that his star witness was drowning. Relevance, Your Honor. Sustained, Judge Whitmore ruled quickly, though the damage was already done. The jury had seen the photos, heard the questions, and begun to doubt the official version of events. But Thornton wasn't finished. Officer Sullivan, is it true that Rex has received specific training to target teenage protesters? That's classified police methodology. I'll take that as a yes. Thornton turned to face the jury directly. Ladies and gentlemen, we're not talking about a police dog performing normal duties. We're talking about a weapon specifically designed to terrorize children. As the day's testimony concluded, Marcus sat quietly in the gallery, absorbing every word. Tomorrow, he would take that same witness stand where Officer Sullivan had just lied under oath. The boy who'd been silenced by trauma was about to find his voice at the moment when it mattered most. The battle lines were drawn, and justice hung in the balance. The courthouse had never been so silent. Even the ancient radiators seemed to hold their breath as 7-year-old Marcus Washington walked toward the witness stand, his small polished shoes clicking against the marble floor like a metronome counting down to destiny. Every eye in the packed gallery followed his journey, reporters leaning forward with pens poised, civil rights leaders clasping their hands in prayer, white spectators watching with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Marcus wore his best clothes, a navy blue suit his mother had saved for months to buy, a crisp white shirt that still held the sharp creases from her careful ironing, and a red tie that his father had taught him to knot himself. But despite his formal appearance, he looked impossibly small in the vast courtroom, a child forced to carry the weight of justice on his narrow shoulders. Sarah Washington sat in the front row of the colored section, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. Beside her, Grandmother Ruby whispered prayers in a voice so low it sounded like wind through autumn leaves. Both women radiated a mixture of fierce pride and paralyzing terror as they watched their precious boy approach the stand where grown men had just spent days lying under oath. David Thornton felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he watched his star witness take those crucial steps. Everything they'd worked for, everything the movement had sacrificed, now depended on whether a traumatized child could find the courage to speak truth in the face of overwhelming intimidation. The court clerk, an elderly white woman who'd administered oaths for 30 years, had to lower the Bible considerably for Marcus to place his small hand upon it. Her voice, usually crisp and professional, softened slightly as she spoke the ancient words. "Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" "I do," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. In the cavernous space, Judge Whitmore peered down from his elevated bench like a hawk studying a field mouse. Despite his racist beliefs, even he felt a flicker of discomfort at the sight of such a young witness. "Son, you need to speak louder so everyone can hear you." Marcus cleared his throat and tried again. "I do." This time his voice carried enough strength to reach the back rows, where photographers adjusted their camera settings to capture what they sensed would be a historic moment. Thornton approached the witness stand with deliberate slowness, his movements calculated to project calm and safety. He'd learned from Dr. Coleman that sudden gestures or loud voices could trigger Marcus's trauma responses, potentially causing the boy to shut down completely. "Marcus, can you tell us your name and age?" "Marcus James Washington. I'm 7 years old." The boy's voice grew slightly stronger with each word, as if speaking his own name reminded him of who he was and why he was there. "And who is your father?" "Reverend James Washington. He's the best daddy in the world." A small smile flickered across Marcus's face, the first genuine expression of joy anyone had seen from him in weeks. "Can you tell us about the day you went to march with your father?" Marcus took a deep breath, his small chest rising and falling as he gathered his courage. "We were walking to the park to pray and sing. Daddy said we were asking God to help make things fair for everybody. There were lots of kids, and we were happy." As Marcus spoke, his voice began to carry more confidence. The courtroom remained absolutely silent except for the boy's words and the occasional scratch of reporters' pens against paper. Even the most hardened segregationists found themselves leaning forward, drawn in by the child's obvious sincerity. "What happened when you got to the park, Marcus?" The boy's expression darkened, and his hands gripped the arms of the witness chair. The policemen had big dogs with them, mean dogs. "I let them loose to chase us. Were you scared?" "Yes, sir, very scared. The dogs were bigger than me, and they looked hungry, like they wanted to hurt us." Thornton glanced at the jury, noting how several men had unconsciously leaned forward. Even these white Alabama males, products of a segregated society, seemed affected by the child's honest testimony. "Marcus, I need to ask you something very important. Do you remember one dog in particular?" The boy nodded vigorously. "The scary one with white paws. He jumped on my sister Carmen and made her fall down. I thought he was going to bite her face." The tension in the courtroom ratcheted up another notch. Carmen, sitting beside her mother, unconsciously touched the fading scratches on her arms, where Rex's claws had found their mark. "That must have been terrifying," Thornton said gently. "Marcus, I need you to look around this courtroom very carefully. Take your time. Do you see that dog anywhere?" This was the moment everything had been building toward. Marcus's small head turned slowly, his dark eyes scanning the courtroom with the methodical precision of a child who'd learned to pay attention to details that could mean the difference between safety and danger. His gaze moved past the jury, box, past the gallery filled with reporters and spectators, past the prosecution table where District Attorney Henley sat with barely concealed anxiety. Then Marcus's eyes landed on Rex, lying calmly beside Officer Sullivan's chair, the dog's scarred muzzle and distinctive white markings clearly visible in the afternoon light streaming through the courthouse windows. For a long moment, boy and beast regarded each other across the courtroom. Rex's ears perked up slightly, as if recognizing the child he'd terrorized weeks earlier. Marcus felt his heart racing, but this time it wasn't just from fear. It was from the sudden realization that he had power in this moment, that his voice could finally matter. Slowly, deliberately, Marcus raised his small right hand and pointed directly at Rex. The silence shattered like breaking glass. "That's him." The two words fell from Marcus Washington's lips like stones dropped into a still pond, creating ripples that spread through the courtroom with devastating force. The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to swallow sound. Itself, no rustling papers, no shifting bodies, no whispered conversations. Even the courthouse pigeons outside seemed to pause their cooing, as if nature itself recognized the magnitude of this moment. Officer Frank Sullivan's face drained of color so rapidly, it appeared as though someone had pulled a plug and let all the blood run out. His confident smirk, worn like armor throughout 3 days of testimony, cracked and fell away to reveal the panic underneath. His thick fingers, which had gripped Rex's leash with such authority during the attack, now trembled as they clutched the witness table for support. "That's the dog that scared my sister," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, as if speaking the truth was feeding his courage like fuel to a fire. "He has white paws and a mean scar on his face, and he jumped on Carmen and made her cry." The boy's finger remained steady, pointing directly at Rex like an arrow of justice finding its target. The German shepherd, perhaps sensing the attention, lifted his massive head and met Marcus's gaze across the courtroom. For a heartbeat, predator and former prey stared at each other, but this time the power dynamic had shifted completely. In the gallery, Carmen Washington gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth as memories of Rex's attack came flooding back. She could almost feel the dog's weight pressing her to the pavement again, smell his hot breath on her face, hear the sound of fabric tearing as his claws found purchase in her dress. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but they were tears of vindication rather than fear. Sarah Washington felt her heart soar with pride even as terror gripped her throat. Her baby boy, her youngest child, who still needed help tying his shoes, was facing down the very system that had tried to break their family. She wanted to run to the witness stand and sweep him into her arms, protecting him from the hostile stares of white jurors and the barely concealed fury of the prosecution. Judge Whitmore's gavel hand froze halfway to the bench as the implications of Marcus's identification crashed over him like a wave. For 30 years, he'd maintained order in his courtroom through intimidation and the unquestioned authority of his position. But how do you intimidate a 7-year-old who's already faced down police dogs? How do you silence a truth so pure it cuts through decades of lies like light through darkness? Objection! District Attorney Henley roared, leaping to his feet with the desperation of a drowning man. The witness is leading the witness. This is highly irregular. But his words felt hollow even to himself. There had been no leading question, no coaching evident in Marcus's response. The boy had simply identified what he saw with the unflinching honesty that only children possess. Thornton stepped closer to the witness stand, his voice gentle, but his eyes blazing with victory. "Marcus, you said the dog has a scar. Can you describe it for us? The boy studied Rex with the careful attention of someone who'd been forced to memorize every detail of his tormentor. It goes from his nose to his ear, like somebody cut him with a knife. And his left ear has a little piece missing at the top. A collective intake of breath swept through the gallery as spectators craned their necks to see Rex more clearly. Sure enough, the scarred muzzle and damaged ear were exactly as Marcus described. The boy's memory was photographically accurate, devastating to any claim that he might be confused or mistaken. In the press section, reporters scribbled frantically, recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Never before had a child witness delivered such damning testimony in a civil rights case. The story would make front pages across the nation. 7-year-old identifies attack dog in historic trial. Walter Cronkite's cameraman, despite strict court rules about filming, managed to capture the moment on film through a partially open door. The image, a small black boy pointing fearlessly at the dog that had terrorized him, would become one of the most powerful photographs of the civil rights era. Sullivan's defense attorney, a local lawyer named Patterson, who'd taken the case reluctantly, tried desperately to salvage his client's reputation. Your Honor, the child is clearly traumatized and confused. His identification could be mistaken. No, I'm not confused, Marcus interrupted with startling firmness, his young voice cutting through the attorney's objection like a sword through silk. I remember everything about that day. I remember how he looked at me like he wanted to hurt me. I remember how his teeth looked when he growled. And I remember thinking he was the meanest thing I ever saw. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Spectators shouted from both sections of the gallery, some calling for justice, others defending the police. Judge Whitmore banged his gavel repeatedly, his face flushed with anger and confusion as he lost control of his own courtroom. Through it all, Marcus remained calm in the witness chair, his small hands folded in his lap as if he were sitting in Sunday school rather than the center of a legal earthquake. The terror that had consumed him for weeks had transformed into something else, quiet strength that seemed to radiate outward, touching everyone who witnessed it. Even some of the white jurors found themselves moved by the boy's courage. Here was a child who'd been attacked by police dogs, whose father sat in jail for demanding basic rights, who had every reason to be afraid, yet he sat straight and tall, speaking truth with the fearless honesty that only the innocent possess. As the gavel finally restored order, everyone in that courtroom understood that something fundamental had just shifted. A 7-year-old boy had just accomplished what years of legal arguments and political maneuvering could not. He'd forced Birmingham to confront the ugly reality of its own brutality. The monster had been named, identified, and exposed by seasoned attorneys or hardened activists, but by a child who simply told the truth. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours, a remarkably short time for a case that had gripped the nation's attention. When they filed back into the courtroom, their faces revealed nothing, but the speed of their decision suggested that Marcus's testimony had left an indelible mark. Judge Harold Whitmore, visibly uncomfortable with the media circus surrounding his courtroom, called for order one final time before the verdict that would echo far beyond Birmingham city limits. Has the jury reached a verdict? Whitmore asked, his voice lacking its usual authoritative boom. The foreman, a middle-aged insurance salesman named Robert Clark, who'd lived his entire life within Birmingham's segregated bubble, stood slowly. His hands shook slightly as he unfolded the paper that contained their decision, a decision that had sparked heated debate among 12 white men forced to confront uncomfortable truths about their city's methods of maintaining order. We have, Your Honor, on the charge of disturbing the peace, we find the defendant guilty. Murmurs of disappointment rippled through the colored section of the gallery. However, Clark continued, his voice growing stronger, we recommend the minimum sentence and asked the court to consider the peaceful nature of the defendant's actions. It wasn't the complete vindication David Thornton had hoped for, but given the segregationist jury and Judge Whitmore's bias, it represented a significant victory. More importantly, the trial had accomplished something far greater than any single verdict. It had exposed the systematic brutality that Birmingham officials had tried so desperately to hide. Judge Whitmore sentenced Reverend Washington to time served plus community service, a punishment so light it amounted to a judicial slap on the wrist. But the real justice would come in the weeks and months that followed, as Marcus's brave testimony continued to reverberate across the nation, like thunder rolling across an open plain. Within hours of the verdict, Walter Cronkite led the CBS Evening News with footage of Marcus pointing at Rex, the image of a small black child fearlessly identifying his attacker, became one of the defining moments of the civil rights movement. Broadcast into millions of American homes, where families were forced to confront the reality of what was happening in the South. The headline in the New York Times read, "7-year-old's testimony exposes police dog brutality in Birmingham trial." The Washington Post followed with an editorial titled, "When Children Must Teach Adults About Courage." International newspapers picked up the story, showing the world that American democracy still had far to go in living up to its founding principles. Officer Frank Sullivan faced immediate suspension pending an internal investigation. The inquiry revealed a pattern of excessive force that had been overlooked or deliberately ignored by his superiors. Rex was retired from active duty and eventually rehomed to a farm outside the city, where the scarred animal would spend his remaining years herding sheep instead of terrorizing children. More significantly, Marcus's testimony prompted a federal investigation into police tactics used against civil rights demonstrators. The Justice Department, under pressure from national media coverage and international embarrassment, began developing new guidelines for law enforcement's interaction with peaceful protesters. The use of attack dogs against children was officially prohibited, though it would take years for these changes to be fully implemented across the South. 3 months after the trial, President John F. Kennedy referenced the Birmingham Children's Crusade in a nationally televised address about civil rights legislation. Though he never mentioned Marcus by name, everyone knew he was referring to the brave boy whose 2 words had helped change America's conversation about racial justice. When children must face police dogs for the simple act of asking for equality, Kennedy declared, "We have failed as a nation to live up to our highest ideals." The Washington family slowly began to heal from their ordeal. Reverend Washington returned to his pulpit with renewed fire, his sermons now carrying the authority of someone who'd suffered for his beliefs and emerged stronger. Sarah found work as a seamstress for families across Birmingham, her reputation for quality spreading beyond the boundaries of segregation as even white customers began requesting her services. Carmen blossomed into a confident young woman who would eventually become a teacher, inspiring countless students with stories of the day her little brother stood up to injustice. She kept the torn yellow dress in her closet as a reminder of how far they'd come and how far they still had to go. But it was Marcus who underwent the most remarkable transformation. The traumatized, withdrawn child who'd hidden in corners and jumped at shadows grew into a confident young man with an unshakable sense of justice. His experience in that courtroom taught him that truth, spoken with courage, could move mountains. Years later, Marcus would graduate from Harvard Law School, the same institution where David Thornton had earned his degree. He returned to Alabama as a civil rights attorney, dedicating his career to defending those who couldn't defend themselves. His first case involved a teenage girl who'd been attacked by a police dog during a peaceful protest, and Marcus found himself reliving his childhood trauma from the perspective of the lawyer rather than the witness. On his office wall, he hung a photograph from that day in 1963, the moment when he pointed at Rex and changed everything. Visitors often asked about the picture, and Marcus would tell them the story of how a 7-year-old boy discovered that sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest power. People think courage is about not being afraid, he would say, gesturing toward the photograph. But real courage is being terrified and speaking truth anyway. That day, I learned that even children can be warriors for justice, not with weapons or violence, but with something much more powerful: the truth. Decades later, as Marcus argued cases before the Supreme Court and taught constitutional law at his father's alma mater, he never forgot the lesson learned in Judge Whitmore's courtroom. Sometimes history pivots on the smallest moments, when ordinary people find extraordinary courage to say exactly what needs to be said. 2 words from a child had indeed changed everything, not just for one family, but for a nation learning to live up to its promise of justice for all.